with this handsome young Englishman who was one of Queen Elizabeth I's sort of 18-year-old lovers when she was, I don't know what she was, she's probably our age. Um, and the magnificent gardens of England are still as magnificent, but recently I have been encountered two new ideas about thinking about British gardens or gardens in general, the world in general, and it's something I haven't quite resolved in my mind because I love a manicured English garden as much as, you know, anybody ever did. And there are sort of two new things going on. One, I read a book, and it's on my website under resources, called The Magnificent Gardens of England, or England's Magnificent Gardens, basically. And it's written by an economist, historian, gardener. And he was very interested in finding out what it really costs to create some of these gardens in, you know, in terms of money today. And he not only took what the pound is worth today, but he also, they factored in what the average salaries were and the cost of living. And so he feels that it's a much truer picture of what things really cost when they were built. And let me tell you, the money that was spent on gardens in England and where it came from was all very interesting. But the other thing that he points out is that it created a industry that brings in about $14 billion a year in England: gardening, garden tourism, plants, all of these things. And then he also talks about how it helped develop a lot of industries in England, such as, you know, the greenhouses were created for plants, but actually it caused them to do steel structures, and a lot of very interesting things that you don't think about, but when you hear them, you go, oh my God. And then the other thing that I've just heard about is rewilding. And this has been sort of on the table in England sort of since maybe 2000 or 20, you know, 20 whatever, and 2000. And the thought is that England, even though we see it as a beautiful green magic place, really isn't, that the land is very degraded. It's been intensely farmed. It's been, you know, smothered in chemicals. It's a lot of it's very unproductive because, you know, there's something like 50,000 acres of England is in grouse moors so that people can go grouse hunting. And this is also, they cut down all the heather, keep it short so you can spot the grouse to shoot, and it's causing the peat bogs to dry out. And so there's a lot of very prominent people that are now getting into this movement, and because of their sort of rock star fame, you know, they're getting publicity. But that movement has definitely been underway with Prince Charles, his organic gardening, and I understand he's now taking over farming his mother's estate at Sandringham as an organic farm. But the people that are rewilding say you've got to go further, and you can only keep a small amount of the farm. You know, by I say farm, and estate is, you know, can be 20, 30,000 acres. They're huge. And usually the owner is not involved in the farming. They rent the parts, you know, part of the properties out to different tenants that can be, you know, very large scale farming, farming companies that do basically agri-farming that we have here, you know, what we're seeing Cargill and people like that do in the United States. And so I sort of started my adventures with history of gardening in 2015 in London. I saw a show at Buckingham Palace in the Queen's Gallery that was a collection of paintings that belong to Queen Elizabeth and have been collected by the royals down from ages. And they are the ones that have been, sort of set the standards for keeping up with the Joneses for gardening in England. And this is the poster by Isaac Oliver, and sort of it gives you an idea of the gentleman gardener. And we started looking at England and what they were early on. This is a Jan Bruegel painting of Eden, of what his vision of Eden, or our vision of Eden, should be. And I'm going to change my thing to speaker view there. And it was something that really was sold throughout Europe as the gardening ideal. And even today, I mean, the garden standards and styles and everything that you want in a garden is usually set by England and at the Chelsea Flower Show. And the Royal Horticulture Society has now become also very involved in promoting rewilding England. And, they feel that gardening is so important to people and to people's health, that it's an important thing to do, but you can do it in a responsible manner. And as I said, it's a very important industry to England, and it brings in such a huge amount of money. Whoops, let's see, why am I not moving forward? Oh my God, why is this not going forward? Oh, there we go. And so looking back, we have, the Chelsea Flower Show, and we have, champagne in the garden, and Prince Charles is growing champagne at Highgrove now, or, he's growing grapes and making champagne, which you can't buy from the United States, I've discovered. And the history goes back to the time even of Queen Victoria. Up here we see on the top, the Brits like to go out into the countryside. Here she's in Scotland, and she's overlooking what looks like a grouse moor or a hunting preserve that they keep just for, these deer that they go out and shoot. And so, not that there's anything wrong with that, but if the land isn't properly managed, then it's very degrading on the land. And as you can see in the picture in the background, and what that she would do, or what they, the aristocracy would do, your rich people, they'd go out and they would pick flowers and flora, collect flora. They were very interested in floral collections, and then press them in their little presses. And then down at the bottom, we see one of our very favorite people, the Dowager Countess from Downton Abbey in front of Highclere, or Downton Abbey as it was in the thing. And the Brits, once again, they love this alfresco dining and tea. And one thing that I discovered while I was doing the research on tea is that the Victorians used to take Bremansia or Datura flowers, and they would steep them, and it's a hallucinogenic, and drink it for tea. Now, every English garden, or by garden, I mean, a sort of 300-acre garden. And I'm not talking about the state, I'm talking about the garden in the estate that would be several thousand acres. During the 17th, 18th century, England had between 400 and 500 estates that were at least 10,000 acres. And so in your garden part of your estate, you did need to have a temple, because it showed how educated you were, and that you'd been on the grand tour of Europe, which usually took several years. And you then you came back and you built all these little temples, or little pavilions, follies, that looked like things that you saw in your grand tour. And then the other idea of English estates now, or what it's been in the past, is you have the beautiful rolling hills with sheep grazing. Sheep grazing by themselves is a no-no for rewilding. You see the Duchess of Devonshire's chickens up there, which are surely fine. And the down there we see our favorite heroine Mary at Downton Abbey, about to go off and ride her horse. And the, the money that went into these people's income with I'm trying to think of who it was that, oh God, think about here, one of the, landed aristocracy was, how they were able to collect the wealth from their land. He had an income of $41 million a year during his life. So you could put a lot of it away. And that the greatest fortunes in England were made in land speculation, and also in farming. So here's Natasha and my husband, Peter, and he bought, when he was in college, he went to Europe for a summer, his grand tour. And his parents gave him enough money to buy a little Hillman, and he instead went off to the used car dealer and bought a 1927 Bentley, which we have had restored in England and kept there for several years, and would go over to Ascot and drive around. And let me tell you, it's a car that you can drive to the front door when you go to visit any garden. The guy in the car park says, "Oh, go park it up in front of the house." And then usually, as I will show you later, I guess next, the owners come out and they say, "Oh, what an interesting car. Oh, I would love to ride in it." And so off my husband goes, driving these owners of these gardens around. This actually is a Great Shawfield Manor down near Bath, which is a Tudor house. It belongs to the National Trust. The family that owns it, which is not the original family, his maybe great grandfather bought it and gave it to the National Trust, still they get to live there for I don't know how long, forever and ever probably. And at nighttime they take down the velvet cords and they use all the rooms. So that was sort of a fun thing to stay. But I met her she was in the United States. She was in Boston giving a lecture about Scottish gardens. So the nicest things happen at our garden club meetings, as we all know. And so Patsy Floyd, who lives there now, has undertaken to recreate a garden that is show-stopping, so that it will bring in a substantial amount of income to the estate, which neither they nor the National Trust farm. There are tenant farmers that farm these 1,000-acre pieces of farmland. And frequently when people give their property or they rewild their property, they keep the immediate area around the house, obviously, in whatever garden was there, or they even recreate a garden, which I will show you later on at Coff Castle. They got money from the government to restore a Repton garden of 150 acres around the castle. And then the rest of it has been rewild. And here are some more pictures of Patsy's lovely roses on her terrace and sitting out in the sun. And then, of course, if you have a National Trust house, you have to have your own private chapel, which they do. Moving on to Chatsworth, and this is a very interesting garden. One, the lupin in front are beautiful. It shows you how you create a hedge interest. You see it hasn't grown, the plants haven't grown up yet, but they will. But you can see, you just sort of ignore the top. And this replaces a big glass greenhouse that was designed by Paxton. And that cost something like $40 million when it was created. And they finally took it down when they found that the heating bill was just prohibitively expensive. They were growing grapes, they were growing pineapples, they were growing all sorts of things that was not really necessary. And what's also interesting, this brings up the idea that we look at a lot of estates that have kitchen gardens, and the kitchen gardens, a gardener, if you were caught stealing, picking a plum or a peach and eating it, he would be severely reprimanded by the head gardener and fined. These gardens, the kitchen gardens that we see, were solely to keep the family and, you know, the sort of house slaves, as it were, in food. And it would be picked and harvested, and it would be sent to wherever, whatever house they were living, if they were in London for the season or whatever. But that's what gardens, you know, vegetable gardens were for. They weren't like for the people. Even though all of this money, you were going to talk about where did all of this money come from at the end too, because that's another interesting thing. Now, here we go to Hampton Court Palace on the Thames River, and I'm sure that probably we've all been there. This is Henry VIII's early castle by the Cardinal Wolsey. And then when William and Mary came to England, they had Christopher Wren build this addition. And when William, they only lived there a few months of the year, but William gets to his royal rooms, which are on, you can see that, you know, that sort of piano nobile. And he finds that after paying Wise, the landscape designer, to lay out this beautiful parterre, that he can't see the river. Oh, so he goes back to London or wherever, and he says, dig it up. Lower the garden 8 feet. Now there are fountains, there's plumbing, there's all sorts of things. There's statuary on pedestals. It all has to be ripped out to the tune of about 5 million. And they put it back in, and he comes back and he gets there, and why someone else did. He says, I still don't have a good enough view down to the river. I want to see the river. Dig it up again and lower it another 3 feet. And they did. And you can see here, this was taken, I think, maybe about 6, 7, 8 years ago. It had just been replanted to also the tune of $6.5 million to, you know, restore this garden at this basically, I was going to say Tudor garden, but there are Tudor gardens there as well. But this William and Mary period garden at Hampton Court. And what's interesting now, this is a picture from now, and you can't see the river, even though you're elevated, because the trees have all grown up. Blenheim, which is another incredible, it's called a palace. It was given to the Duke of Marlborough after he beat Napoleon, or he beat the Spaniards, or we beat, you know, he was a great warrior for England, and the Queen rewarded him greatly and made him the Duke of Marlborough. And you can see the Poussin painting that people say was partially inspirational for the garden, and the palace was done by John Vanberg, and then the early gardens were done by Wise, and then later Capability Brown. And so we see the Capability Brown garden now, and it's really what we think of when we think of this. Now, this garden, this cost $66 million to do his garden for Mr. Capability Brown. And probably 3/4 of it was, or 1/4 of it was put into the palace, because it's called a palace, not just the garden. But this lake, which was created, took 6 years to build. They had to dig it out. They had to hand pack all the clay at the bottom, and they put several layers of hand packed clay. And then he had 60 men working, I can't remember how long, forever and ever on it. And then after they got it all built, it took 2 years to fill it with water from the stream. Stowe, another great garden that we can all go and see now, because I think it's a National Trust or a foundation that runs the garden. And it was done by the Viscount Cobham as a political statement. Now, actually, he had another garden here before, but he decided that he he was forced to retire from the army, which is a very lucrative job, to be in the service of the government. Either if you're in the army, you bought a commission, and then usually your commission would pay for whatever you paid the money that you would make in about 3 years. And you'd make your salary was several $1,000,000 a year. And so anyway, he was sent home, and so he went back and he rebuilt his garden, and he had the paths, he called it the paths to vice, virtue, and liberty, and he sort of took swipes at the king and the prime minister who he was at odds with. And when he redid the garden, he also can't do there's a famous quote out, he leaped the fence and he saw all nature of a garden, and he built things like this beautiful Palladian bridge. Now, Harry Hoare at Stourhead is another really good story. And this is, I got all this money stuff from this book by the Magnificent Gardens of England by the economist, historian Gardner. And while it's an incredibly beautiful garden, Walpole called it the most picturesque scene in the world, and it most certainly is. It's built around a great lake, and there's a trail that goes around. You can there's an outer trail that you can ride on your horse, or here you can walk along, and then you would view these different, once again, these different classical buildings that have been put in as follies or around the garden, but you also could go in them, and you would have lunch, and the servants would all, lunch would appear, right? And many of them were also heated. The main house wasn't heated, but the follies were. And there are also stories that they were heated because he had naked orgies with all of his friends there, but that we don't know for sure. At Paynes Hill, another wonderful garden that you can go to see. This ruined church really was built to tried to build a brick factory there, and he couldn't do that. So he turned it into a church ruin, which is very romantic, is the word I think that he liked to. Now, the Honorable Charles Hamilton was the youngest son of 9 to the Duke of Abercrombie, and who had 16 children. And so, being the youngest son of 9, he had no fortune whatsoever. And so he needed money. And luckily, he was friends with the banker, Mr. Hoare, who made sure that he got royal commissions. And so he was appointed to be the keeper of the household for the Prince of Wales. And this is another one of those jobs that's called old compensation. He was paid $2.7 million a year to basically do nothing. And it all went along very nice. And he was, spending money building his garden that he had bought. And this is a metal tent that's another place. You sit in it and look out at the view. And I'm sure they had plenty of lunches served there as well. But he objected to the fact that the Prince of Wales was having an affair with his sister, Lady Jane Hamilton. And so he got so mad that he quit. And he did have the wit to have another job lined up as the director of the King's Mines, which was another title job that you didn't have any work. You had your accountant did the work for you. And he pulled in another $2.3 million a year in salary in this role. And all of these are little follies that he designed around the property, and you come to one and then you go on, and then you see it in the distance, and you go through a little forest or a little glade, and you come out, and then you're right there with it. But then off in the distance you see another thing saying, come and look at me, and including this beautiful grotto that you can go in. And he had a man that lived there, his own hermit, because it was very chic to have a hermit. And the hermit would turn the water on for your guests when they came. And these gardens, these last 3 or 4 gardens I've showed you, were all basically open to the public if you were the proper public, and you would tip the head gardener, and you would be taken on a tour through the garden. And it was, usually the owner wasn't even there. And so the gardens were meant to be seen and admired, right? We all like to have garden tourists come to our gardens. Now, the royals really set the standard for things. This is Kew, the great botanical garden. And that's the great pagoda that was just recently restored to the tune of, I think, $5.5 million. And it cost, an earlier restoration was $6 million. And so this was all royal money, because the Kew was basically, is where Queen Charlotte, married to our great George III, that we all, think about often. When he was in his mad state, she would go out and live at a house at Kew, and she was very interested in botany, as the whole family had been. This actually, the pyramid and the Kew was built by her mother-in-law, Queen Alexandria. But the Brits were very interested in bringing back plant material, and every Royal Navy ship that went out for anything had on board a botanist, and he would go, and every time they landed somewhere, he would go ashore and he would find things that he thought should be brought back to England. And sometimes they were willingly given, and other times they were taken either by force or by stealing them. But I think a lot of us know that about taking little clippings and putting them in your golf bag and things like that it does happen to people in horticulture that have the best of intentions. Now, when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert came to the throne, that was when England was really at the peak of the sort of industrial age, and also in farming. The printing presses were going full-time. Garden magazines were available. Garden catalogs were, 50, 60 pages long. They made our catalogs from whatever it is, Wayfair Gardens, look like, little Chinese restaurant menus or something. But they were able to, offer all sorts of plant material, because England itself has something like 74 endemic plants that means that plants that were growing there at the time that England was joined to Europe over Doggerland. And so that the plants, could move back and forth however plants are moved. But so the English have never had a problem with bringing in invasive species, and they didn't, native plants aren't quite the thing that we think of here as being the all saving grace, because all of the birds and the bugs and all of that are so long adapted to whatever is there with these sort of alien species that have brought in, that they're quite able to exist. But this is the time that everybody was out gardening as well. And they said that this is also the time that nowadays they say people spend an hour a week in the garden, every man in England. But it doesn't sound like a lot of time, but it's the largest consumption of free time following watching television. And so Queen Victoria, this is, an interesting sort of take on where people were. They are having these great sort of garden parties. And I understand that she was very egalitarian in the people that were invited to her garden parties, just as we learned from watching The Crown that Queen Elizabeth these days also, uses it as a means of bonding with her subjects. And so everybody's here at Buckingham Palace for a garden party, and the Queen Victoria is in her little coach being taken through, and everybody's oohing and aahing. And at this point in time, this is sort of around the 1850s, that not only was there this acknowledgement of people liking to be out in the nature, as it were, or in parks or whatever. There weren't any parks then. And so parks like Birkenhead Park that we all know about because our dear Frederick Law Olmsted, right, was inspired by it. But Birkenhead Park started out as a development, as a way to, make money. And what the Birkenhead Corporation did was then around the park, they owned the property around the park, and they sold it as very nice housing. But anybody could go to the park for free. And that's one of what impressed Olmsted so much, as well as the landscaping, which was, the landscaping of the English taste at that time, the garden anglaise. They felt that mankind would be elevated by communing with nature. And one of the books that I read said that by going out to a park and being in nature, because people were moving to the cities, one for food, for jobs, because they needed the industrial age had taken over. And so by being in parks, it would keep them out of beer halls. It would keep them from going to bear baitings and boxing matches. And then for the ladies like us, it would keep us from reading novels. That was something that wasn't always approved of. And so the park movement there became, another thing. Now, Birkenhead Park, which is interesting, at that time cost $141 million to build. And as I said, within 1 year, it was operating at a profit by selling off the adjacent property to this beautiful park. And it gave them the money also to build the park, the city of Liverpool. Now, the Queen and Prince Albert, since they, couldn't stay in London all year, they went up to Scotland, to Balmoral, which we see here, which is also another site of contention at the moment, because a huge amount of the estate is in stock. It's for stocking, for both the grouse shooting and for shooting the deer. But it wasn't just for, it was the deer didn't live natural lives doing what deer should be doing in forests, which is actually aerating the soil. They're more of a where they're let go for the stocking. And they're farmed, basically. And so at Balmoral, you can see the royal family here, all their children. They had like dozens of children. And they also built a house down on the Isle of Wight called Osborne House. And then the children had a little Swiss cottage, and they had their own garden, their own vegetable garden, and which their father made them have a garden and do garden. And they sold everything they grew to the kitchen. They didn't give it to charity or anything like that. Now, I'm sure you're all sort of wondering again, when I talked about the money, where the money came from. Well, this is Harwood House, which belonged to the Lascelles family. And if you watched The Queen, which I'm sure you all did, you can remember that David Lascelles was the Queen Elizabeth's father's private secretary, and he was a rather evil person. And he comes from a family of rather evil people also. The family's original money was built on slaves and plantation owners. The young the first Earl of Harwood went off to Barbados, and he married a Barbados heiress that owned a lot of plantations, and they had about 9,000 slaves working the plantations. And so it produced quite a healthy income. And that his son hired Capability Brown to come in, and then we see the Capability Brown Lake and the forest. And what he did is very interesting, is underneath is planted with laurel, so it reflects light back up into the forest, and it makes it look, very scenic. And it also keeps out whatever, so you're creating a solid block that normally a tree you wouldn't have at the base of the tree. And Queen Victoria visits this Harwood House, and she says, "Oh, the park seems very fine, and the view from the window is very pretty," which I thought was a great description of appreciating landscape. Now, once again, here we see Highclere or Downton Abbey. And the original house was rebuilt by the architect Barry, who did the Houses of Parliament. And at Highclere, we also see a very interesting new thing that we're looking at now, the ha-ha, which means that you could stand at the house or the property around the house, which was also lawn. They didn't have usually these terraced gardens anymore. And you'd look out and you'd see the animals over here grazing away, but you didn't realize, why they didn't come and sort of eat the lawn. It's because they had this fencing that would drop down into a big ditch, and so the animals couldn't get through. And here's a sort of a drawing of explaining how it worked. And this is Capability Brown Garden. Once again, it's called a garden, but it's really the whole, the garden included what they called was a park that was done by Capability Brown around the house, the estate house, whatever. And then there would be perhaps a walled garden or a kitchen garden, once again, providing food for the household. And Capability Brown always looked at the landscape and he said, "Oh, it has such capabilities that we could do if you just let me have a free hand in designing this." So he always saw the positive capabilities of the property, and once again built wonderful little follies. At Rawsham, which is another wonderful piece of property that you can go and visit, we see a lot of sort of getting off towards a wildly look, but I think it's really was more for economy of maintenance than actually a preference, because you see here we have, incredible sculpture, and here we have a beautiful cedar of Lebanon glauca tree. And what the rewilding people are saying, this is what should be our sculpture. We don't need sculpture stuck out in the woods. We need more beautiful trees, which I think a lot of us would agree with. Now, the standard, as I was saying, that was set for so many people by the Brits every year is the Chelsea Flower Show, and everybody that's really interested in gardening seriously goes to Chelsea. And in fact, big estate owners come and they bring their head gardeners so they can go around with their little notebook and write down what they want ordered and planted at home. But the Royal Horticulture Society has 680 some thousand members. So it's quite influential in this nation of gardeners, is what I would really call England. And it takes place every year on the banks of the Thames River, and 11 acres. And the Christopher Wren built what's called the Chelsea Pensioners Hospital. It's like basically like a VA hospital. And these old pensioners that have served the empire go there and live in their retirement. Now, I have to show you a couple of pictures of my favorite gardener's gardens that he always does at Chelsea. He comes from a Sienese banking family, of all things. And his flower plantings are all done by Fergus, the head gardener for Christopher Lloyd down at Great Dixter. But you can see this is probably about 10 years old, but here they've already gotten rid of most of the lawn. So sort of it's the gravel, it's a small amount of planting. We have the water around because water is important for wildlife. It's important for people to listen to. It adds a thing. And so I've always loved this, and it's so Chelsea, it is called the Royal Horticulture Society, and it is the Queen sets the tone for the nation. And she is, of course, the patron. Now, not only is the Queen the most important person really there, but the children. The Royal Horticulture Society has taken over trying to make horticulture education available to all the children in England and to have them develop a love for gardening. And here you can see a group of school children, and this was taken on press day. So they're sort of, I don't know, somebody knew somebody, have been brought to come and admire the gardens, and they're quite young children. But the other thing that fascinated me was to see, going back and looking at this is one of the gardens, and I took a picture of it because here we see a dandelion growing in what at that time was a pretty pristine garden situation of gardens that are shown at Chelsea. And now all of these gardens, I've been asked, they don't just go away at the end. Usually they're either planted at some hospice or some hospital, or the plants are sold off, but they don't just totally die. And of course, there I am with a garden designer that I was very fond of, and we were pretending we were having tea for a photo shoot in her garden. But that's still what, once again, it's that British idea of dining al fresco. Now at Chelsea, the plants are important, and they're not always plants like these beautiful, beautiful flowers that basically don't have too much use other, and they're cultivated by definitely they're not wild in any sense of the imagination. The gardens all have a message. Gardens do have messages, and here one of the messages is that it's very important to have water in the garden because water brings tranquility to people, and gardening brings tranquility to people. And the Royal Horticulture Society is very much involved with the holistic attitude that and trying to have people realize that gardens are just the most important, can be the most important part of your life, and they can make life so much more meaningful and pleasant. Now, another message that they've had is climate change, and here we see an Italian type Mediterranean garden from of Rome, but they're looking at what grows in Mediterranean situations, as was an inspiration for Beth Caddo, who did a gravel garden quite a few years ago, and saying that this is, we're going to run out of water. We're going to run out of a lot of things. It's going to be hotter and hotter. And here's an example of what you can do. Now, one of the great influencers in gardening in England, of course, is Prince Charles. And he has been sort of taken a very holistic attitude toward gardening and created, everything's organic and all of these things. And yet he hasn't quite committed to rewilding, other than he has areas that are quite wild, such as the stumpery. But it's not a real wild place. It's a created wild area. As you can see by what he's done to the yews that grew along here, he has a sense of humor. And then he takes his gardens that he does at the Chelsea Flower Show home and puts them somewhere in the estate at Highgrove. And this was a Mediterranean garden that he did earlier as well, down here in the bottom right. Now we come back to Northumberland and more of the stories of money. And the Percys, that's who I was thinking of. This family has an income of $41 million a year from their estates. And so at one point, they hired Capability Brown to re-landscape the castle, and he built this, water feature, because he always likes water, around the castle, and for millions and millions. And then the present Duchess of Northumberland decided to build a garden, and one of her most famous parts of her garden was the poison garden, where she actually has not only deadly nightshade and all of these things, but she has marijuana growing. I've been told that's why they have the fences, because people want to steal them, pick the marijuana, not because they are worried about them taking some poison plants away. And so this is the garden that she has created for the tune of $56 million a few years ago. And she talks a lot about water and how important it is in the water, and has, financed some studies. And she said that a human can sense water at 85 feet away. You might not consciously know that there's water 85 feet away from you, but your body knows, and it relaxes it and it calms it, because 85% water. Now, Prince Charles is one of his favorite gardens that did the stumpery, that wild area, are the Bannermans, and that's Julius and Isabel Bannerman. And Isabel Bannerman, just about a year ago, wrote a book that I highly recommended about scent in the garden. And the Brits can speak English so well, and they write it so well, that it's very pleasant to read it. But you can see this is their house three houses ago. It was a Tudor monastery that was taken over when Henry VIII dissolved all of the church lands and took them over. And the Bannermans live here, and they entered a competition to design a garden in New York in memorial to I guess there was sort of, trying to think how many Brits that were killed in 9/11 that were, young. Most of them were young people that were working in New York down at, in the finance business. And so they won the competition. And not only did we get them as our designers, but we got Prince Charles, who's a very good friend of theirs, to be the patron of our garden. And I have to share some pictures with you of this wonderful, wonderful house that they have in this garden that they have created there. Oops, wait, I'm going the wrong way. Now they also have a meadow, and they've, Prince Charles, I didn't show you Prince Charles's meadow, but he most certainly has meadows. And in 2013, he invited I think maybe 90 landholders that had substantial meadows throughout the British Isles to Highgrove for lunch. And he suggested that as a present in honor of the Queen's 60th year of reigning, that they should create, they're called coronation gardens, and they are all meadows, and they took the seeds from other meadows that were successful meadows that had plants indigenous to the area, and they created 90 new coronation meadows as a present for the Queen. And so meadows have become very popular, and I know they're popular here too. But in England, once again, I said they don't have this native plant hang up that we seem to have. I shouldn't call it a hang up, but it's basically it is. And here, David Morrison at this new house, Whitson House, has created a meadow. It's a prairie meadow using American prairie plants. And he was helped by James Hitchmuth, who is a lecturer in biology and botany at the Sussex University, because the universities are very interested in rewilding and recreating meadows, because it seems that while you wild something, it doesn't just become a forest, and it doesn't just become a forest because of you have to have animals, and the animals will eat down the young shoots of the trees and keep the area open to areas open to meadows. So you don't have just forest, you have forests, meadows, wetlands, all of these good things, they all work together. And a lot of the homeowners now are using, instead of swimming pools or fountains and things, they're having plant filtration for their water features. And once again, here we see these water features that are calming to us, and they are definitely something that's important to the wildlife, be it the birds or the insects in your garden or whoever comes to visit you. This is the Bannerman's next house after the Tudor house. This actually is a fort down on the Cornwall coast that was belongs to Prince Charles. And it was built to, keep the invaders from England at bay. And the Bannermans took it over. And once again, you can see they're getting wilder and wilder in their planting, and it's getting more, you can almost use the word frowsy, but it's also very, very stunning and beautiful. Now, the Bannermans are not always perfect. They have at Arundel Castle, they have recreated this Garden Follies, which sort of harkens back to the British Empire in India, and also to the stage designer Indigo Jones. And the interesting thing is this is all their folly work here is created out of wood, not stone. And it's probably wood that's harvested on the estate. Once again, you can see, and here we have water. We have agapanthus, which don't need to be watered, I've discovered in my garden here in sunny California. Actually, it has been so cold here. It's been 63 degrees for the last 3 weeks, and I, go outside and wear my down jacket. And so this is more of an ordinary everyday garden, but you can see it's what I like, and I think which was said, we think of a typical English, more normal garden of the clipped hedges juxtaposed to the, the fluffy, beautiful flowers and this lovely tree, which I'm sure it's not an olive, but it looks like an olive tree to me. And so we still, see these kind of gardens. And this is once again my favorite, Luciano, designing a garden in London that is definitely leaping the fence and borrowing the neighbor's trees as part of his scenery. But he has also the nice tight clipped hedges and the green lawns that, oh my God, the English love so much. And I love these green lawns with mowed stripes in them. The Garden History Museum in London, which is right next to Lambeth Palace, which is the home of the Archbishop, the bishop. The the Church of England is also a very large landholder. It's one of the largest landholders in England, and the rewilding advocates are saying the Church of England has a moral responsibility to help save the country, the planet, and that they should be rewilding their property, or a good bit of it. And so at the garden, back to the Garden Museum, which is, they've just built a new building. It wasn't an old church that has been, I don't know what it's called, decommissioned. And here we see the tombs of the two John Tradiskins. They were the plant hunters for King Charles that he sent out, and they came to Virginia in the United States, and they went shopping looking for plants to bring back to England. Now, to the rewilding movement, which is I'm very new to, and I wish I'm only looking forward to learning more about it. Knepp Castle, which has a 250-acre Repton Park around the castle, versus all of the land that's, I think it's 27,000 acres, that most of it is leased out to farms. And they've taken back a lot of it. But as I said, that the farmland benefits by having this rewilded land around it. It means that there aren't the chemicals coming over to the, the food that your grandbabies are going to eat. It means that there's all sorts of nature going on in, they're right there in the fields next to you. Even quite a long time ago, the British government was paying all of the landowners to keep their, the verges, the edges of all their roads in wild plant material, not mowing them back, because it was so important for the wildlife, which is just disappearing. And these bugs we're finding out are all important. The fungus is important. All of these things that we have just put so little value on, now we're finding are just important to our life here on the planet. And a book I highly recommend, you can get an audiobook as well, The Return to Nature by Isabella Tree, who is married to Charles Burrell. And this Knepp Castle came into the family in 1080 when his ancestors came over with William the Conqueror. So they are very vested in the land, and they love their land, and they want to see it change for the better. And one thing that they do, as I said, you need to keep the open spaces. They have reintroduced these wild ponies that are actually, prehistoric ponies practically, that roam now freely on the land. As they have also, those aren't the roebuck, maybe they are the roebucks, that are the, once again, they're practically prehistoric animals that lived on the land when it was wild in Britain, before people were there, or in the beginning, when there was a very small number of people there. And these animals, they also, they do a certain amount of clearing. Nature seems to take care of itself. Now, this is why it's gotten a lot of publicity. In fact, I just watched the movie he made. Randall Plunkett, who is the 21st Baron of Dunsany. This castle is one of the oldest inhabited castles in the United Kingdom. And it was built in 1180. And granted, he is he's a metal rock musician, and he makes a movie called Green Sea, which I recommend. And I saw it on Amazon. but he has decided that he is going to rewild his estate in Ireland, and he's doing it in parts. And you can see how beautiful this is looking as a rewild woodland. And you notice it's not a dense canopy woodland that a wild woodland really would have open little meadows and glades in the woods. And so that oak trees could grow, because oak trees wouldn't grow unless they can get sunlight. And they've been losing all their oak trees in England because of their, sort of sitting out in the middle of pastures now, and they get impacted by the farm tractors and whatever combines going around their roots, and they're all dying off. And then just say nothing of the the one tree in the huge field that all the cows go under, and the cows all weigh about 800 pounds, it seems. But they're also reintroducing a breed of cattle that is close to the prehistoric cattle that were in England when the land bridge was there. And then here we see Randall out there with his dog in his meadow. You see, we've got another meadow here. And then the different trees, but the openings that the grazing keeps. And then it works. And he too has the herd of the deer, which are important. And then on these ventures, these rewilding ventures, because you say, well, how can you afford to do it? Peter said, oh, you've got to be so rich to be able to just do this, to have this little whatever menagerie going on in your estate. And it seems that they make a lot of money selling off, culling these herds of deer and wild ponies that they have. And they also have introduced a prehistoric pig and some other animals that would have been all living in prehistoric Ireland or prehistoric Britain. And so there's a certain, by very careful culling of these herds and selling off the meat, that they can. And then the Burrells, they have opened a safari camp, and it's not you go and look at the deer, and you look at the pigs, and you look at things, and you sleep in a yurt, and it's not like when the African safari. And that they're also it's a great generator of income, and people are very interested in what's going on. Young Lord Randall said when he started to rewilding this, that he got hate letters. People would slash his tires that say, you're taking one of Ireland's most beautiful farms, and his farm actually was productive. That you're taking it and turning, you're destroying all this hard work that some farmers have felt, making this into fields and fields and fields and fields. And so he says that it does work. It can work financially as well as an idea, as a moral idea. Now you're all laughing, I know. This is at, I believe, the Hampton Court Flower Show. I did not take this picture. This is an RHS picture for people to look at. That not everybody has an estate garden, not everybody has a suburban garden, not everybody has much of a garden at all. These little ladies, have this little teeny front yard, and they've got plants growing here that are pollinators, and and then supposedly you can, let all the dead leaves fall. Like you can see, there's junk all behind. They're not keeping it clean, so the little bugs can go in there, and the caterpillars can do their things in the plant. And you can have a wild garden. You just have to decide you're going to have a wild garden, and you can have one, and you can do your part to help. Now, for more of us, this is probably what we would aspire to. But look over here at this little bug hotel and this bird feeder, and to attract more friendly birds to eat the unfriendly insects that are in your garden. And it's very, it's definitely working there. Now, this was also a suggestion of, if you weren't quite ready to go quite that wild, you could do something like this. These are all wild plants that self-seed. These are the water for birds, for insects, for wildlife using your garden. You have trees back here as sculpture. You keep it as low key as possible and as wild as possible. And it also means that the birds are attracted from neighbor's garden to another neighbor's garden. And I've seen ones that have little holes in the fence sort of for the squirrels to run through. And, so the possibilities are unlimited. Now, gardens are where man and nature come together. I mean, that's really the bottom line. And it's always been the bottom line for me and for all of us. And I've loved the gardens like Vaux-le-Vicomte, where, everything's clipped and they say tortured to the maximum, and everything is perfection. But, man isn't really torturing those plants. It's just what man is doing, and man is part of nature as much as, a plant, basically. And so you could have a garden like this, which is relatively wild. I'm not sure, I forget which of the wisterias is a native wisteria and which is Chinese and which is Japanese. You can tell by the way they wrap when they grow, but it escapes me at the moment. We're gonna all end up in the garden sooner or later. And it's another very interesting thing that's coming up these days about taking up land to bury people. And you can't spread ashes in the garden. It doesn't work. Ashes don't work in the garden. And there now is a new method of composting people. But one of the things that when cemeteries were first built, like Kendal Cemetery in London, they were also built as a commercial venture. And people thought they were very supportive of the idea of having cemeteries, because it was an open place with beautiful trees and grass and plants. And people could go there on Sundays or whatever and go for walks and be out in nature, which is a very interesting thing. Now, the director of the Conservatory of Flowers in San Francisco he's leaving us, and he's moving to Boston or Cambridge to Mount Auburn Cemetery for twice the salary. But he was telling me, I asked him, well, what does it cost to be buried there? I mean, I was just sort of interested in what it costs to be buried these days. And he said, oh, well, you can go for $4,000 in some, less scenic spot. He said, but the really prime real estate is $400,000. I thought, oh, that's interesting. He says, oh, you could also have yourself made into a diamond. But from my understanding of that is that the value of the diamond created is equal to the cost of being made into a diamond. So that was sort of, and in this light, this picture belongs to Queen Elizabeth. It was a war trophy from France. It belonged to Josephine, Napoleon's wife, at Malmaison. And it was painted by Rembrandt back in the 1600s. And it's the moment of Mary realizing that who she thought was the gardener, she said, oh, what's happened to Jesus that was buried here? She is just now realizing that the gardener is Jesus. And we are given a hint by his garden hat and his garden spade. And over here, the tomb of the angel, they're guarding the tomb where they're standing there. And so it was at that time, or the message for people was that Jesus would pave the way from an earthly garden to a heavenly garden and paradise. And I think that that's how I used to end my lectures, but now I go on and say, we should all be thinking about rewilding, and to see the world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower was said by William Blake. And it's a very beautiful sight to see this prehistoric pony in this wild forest and meadow in England. And I think that it's something that we all, being that we all love gardens and we love nature and we love so many things, that we should think about. And so on that happy note, I suggest that you all Google rewilding and read about it and think about it.